I'm Kendall, and I'll be speaking with Tyler. If you're joining us today, thank you. We know we're the last conference of the day, so thanks for taking your personal time, probably not work hours, to join us on accessibility in a product with thousands of screens. So a little bit about Intuit. We're the makers of TurboTax, QuickBooks, and Mint. Our headquarters are in Mountain View, but both Tyler and I are from the San Diego area. We were founded in 1983, and we're about 9,400 employees with 50 million customers worldwide. And for our agenda, we'll be focusing first on the scope of the problem, the routes we took to solve that problem, hitting strides to clean up our code, and where we are today and the progress we've made.
So over the course of this talk, we're going to be talking about a project that took place over the last couple of years working on TurboTax, which is a product maybe everyone on this call might not be familiar with. So what is TurboTax? TurboTax is an online tax preparation product that is primarily used in the United States and Canada. And so what that means is every year, people have to go and submit some paperwork to the government for their taxes. And TurboTax helps customers go ahead and fill out those forms in what is hopefully an easy and intuitive way. So people aren't going onto a website and filling out all of the forms that the United States government put together. The product is kind of taking those and breaking them down into simple questions that hopefully are a lot more intuitive to navigate. And on top of that, the product's doing a lot of work to either help you import documents or also figure out what forms you even need to fill out and file. So hopefully you're only answering the questions that you actually need to answer. And when we're referring to that style of experience, we call that the interview experience. And it's kind of mirrored after an interview that you might have in person. So if somebody was asking you questions about your past year, that's kind of what the whole product tries to feel like. And so the whole goal of that is that, again, that it's just more personal, more conversational. But with that interview experience comes a lot of complexity. In order to kind of express all of this tax code and all of these different forms as a bunch of broken down simple questions, it takes thousands and thousands of possible screens. And some of those screens are hit by almost every customer. And some of them are only hit if you have very specific things happening in your tax return. Maybe there's a specific form for boats or something. And so only a subset of customers that applies to are actually going to see that screen. And kind of on top of that, screens also can kind of get a little bit dated, or they're updated less frequently if the tax code around them is also updated less frequently. So if you think about what teams are actually focusing a lot of their time on in the interview, a lot of it is focused on the screens everyone sees, and also the things that we need to refresh to match new tax code. And so you've got thousands of possible screens. You've got these teams working across it. Some of the screens may not have been worked on in the last year or two. And with all of that, a lot of the same product constraints that every other product has apply. So when somebody's going through TurboTax, ideally, it'll be a consistent experience that feels like it was built by one company and one team of designers and developers. And so there's a lot of complexity with making all of these screens feel like one cohesive experience, even if there's a bunch of different people working on it and they may not have even worked on that screen in a long period of time. So to manage a lot of that complexity, we treat a lot of the central interview experience as sort of a design system where it's all kind of managed and deployed centrally. So the page is built out of components like input fields and radio buttons and other common patterns that appear in the forms or in our question and answer experience. And so those those can all be designed and updated centrally, and then even a screen that hasn't necessarily been updated by a team in the last year will still get the latest designs. And on top of that, in order to kind of make that system work, we've also built out about 500 of what we call mocks, which are basically example screens of like the common patterns you'll see. So even though we might not run a test that touches all of the thousands of different tax scenarios that are possible, we hope that we're testing all of the different normal UI patterns that might appear in those screens. And so over the course of this talk, we're going to be going through a project that we did to actually be a lot more proactive and fix a lot of the problems in that interview experience with regards to accessibility. And so taking you back in time to kind of the beginning of the project and where we were when we started, we have this huge number of screens. There's a team of anywhere from like 3 to 5 people actively working on managing the central set of designs for all of those screens. We have some accessibility fixes that we're doing, but we're doing those mostly through bug reports. And bug reports tend to skew towards really common screens, like the ones that everyone hits. More people either tell us that if there's an issue, or more of our QA resources go towards those, so it's easier to find them. And we didn't really have any necessary processes in place from the development or the design side to kind of proactively audit issues from our end. It was mostly a feedback loop where we'd put out new releases, and then we'd hear back from the different quality teams about things we needed to fix. And so scoping the whole accessibility problems in the space was pretty difficult because we knew we had all these screens, but we really didn't have great visibility into how good we were doing on accessibility. And so with that, we put together some goals for being what we called proactive about accessibility. So taking a more active role in our design and our development process to, 1, figure out how many problems do we actually have, and then 2, how do we build kind of a solution for all of this where we can start being more proactive about accessibility and integrating it into our developer workflow and trying to get rid of issues that may have not even been found yet. And so the first goal for that we knew had to be in there was using automation. And this was just due to the constraints we had. We have a huge number of screens and a small number of people to work on this. So we need some sort of tools to help us focus in on what's important. We wanted to make sure that as a first step, we try to stop developers from introducing any new accessibility issues into the interview experience. And then that would come before actually learning more about what issues we have out there and starting to fix them over time. And then we wanted to be able to focus in on the most widespread issues first, since things that occur on almost every screen will have such a huge benefit for customers if we can go ahead and fix it, as opposed to fixing an experience in just one screen. And we also went into the project knowing that this would be sort of a long-term thing to learn more about the accessibility of the product, go ahead and fix it, and maintain it long-term. So we wanted to be able to track our improvement over time and have that as kind of a benchmark to keep us focused on continuing to solve problems. And so with that, I'm going to head over to Kendall, who will talk about automation.
So we had our goal set, thank you, Tyler, and we knew we needed to find an automated a way to automate accessibility. So we began looking at a few options. After looking around a bit, we settled on Axe Core. It fulfilled most of our important requirements. 0 false positives, for example. Axe will not add any accessibility testing rules unless they're sure that they will not create false positives. So, you might not cover every single test case using Axe, but you'll be able to look through the errors and the outputs and be sure that they are all accurate results in all our errors that are showing up. And then it was important to us to find something that's easy to integrate into our system. So Axe for us, being able to add that into our builds, we weren't changing much. We were able to just seamlessly throw that in and have it work. And now that we've picked our testing framework, we began integrating it into our code. We wanted to utilize the fact that we were running cross-browser testing already. So after each automation test that ran on a browser, we ran Axe before leaving the web page. And then once we gathered results, we compiled them together to provide feedback. And with that, we got our initial results. So after integrating Axe Core, we found that we had approximately 2,000 violations in 500 of our mock screens. This was the number of violations after we turned off some rules that we were saving for later in our accessibility story, such as color contrast and duplicate IDs. And then we began reporting those violations on every PR. This way we can ensure that we're not introducing new bugs as we're implementing and eliminating them. We determined that many of the violations that many of the violations were caused by 13 high impact components. Components such as links and buttons, common components that were reused a lot in our design system. And therefore, by focusing on those high impact components, we were able to eliminate many bugs on several different pages that we were seeing. And then after our initial result, we wanted to create a process for documenting these test cases. We began adding Axe into our PR pipeline. We categorized those results to showcase our biggest failures and where we needed to spend the majority of our time. We only added features and bugs that would improve accessibility, not hinder it. So if a PR had a violation, we would wait to merge it until that violation was fixed. And we provided links to the screens that were causing bug failures, so we knew where those bugs were happening, and therefore they were easier to fix for us.
On the right side of the screen here, we have kind of an example of that. And basically, this is what would be shown to a developer. So in their actual PR flow, a bot will come in and comment and say, hey, here's the accessibility report for your changes. Here's a number of screens or tax topics. And here's the number of errors that were found in master, in like the main branch of the code base. And here's all of the errors that were in there with your change. And so at a glance, a developer can get an idea of any of the things that may have been impacted. And so that kind of goes back to what Kendall said about like helping the developers narrow in on individual pages that were impacted by a change.
Thank you. And then charting our progress. So when we were going through this process, we wanted to chart the progress and show our effects on the product. So we created a script that would collect the Axe violations every release, and we could track our track the number of violations over time and ensure we were making improvements and showcase the work we had been doing on our products. And so, yes, to the right, we have a little chart showing kind of just like an idea of what our charts might have looked like.
And so after laying all of that groundwork for finding out, hey, we have 2,000 violations across all of these screens, we've identified some high impact components, and we have things in place to actually chart progress over time, we actually started to go in and start addressing issues proactively. And so the first month, we were actually able to fix a surprising number of the issues. And I think this was like a huge takeaway for the project, was that when you have issues that are fairly widespread, fixing very small trivial things that are mistakes, but fixing them can have a really huge impact across an entire product. And it definitely multiplies as your product gets more complicated and has more screens in it. And so in the first month, we were able to fix 1,350 out of the approximately 2,000 initial violations, which is a huge amount. And when you break down some of the fixes we were doing, it starts to make sense. One of the big things was links. Links are something that appear on most screens in the product. So they're very small, they're very fundamental, but you need to make sure you're doing them properly, because a violation in your core like link component is going to be reflected on every screen. And so for us, there was some minor ARIA attributes that we were doing wrong on links in the product. And so it was really important to fix those. And once we fixed it, that was a change that could get rid of almost 500 violations, since almost every screen encountered a link of some sort. Another really big example for us was tables. Inside of TurboTax, you can encounter screens that might have a table grid with a lot of inputs in it. And those kind of relate back to a little bit more of the forms that are going into the tax return. And so with those, it's really important that we're using all of the proper rules to allow people to navigate within a table grid, but it's also important that we're linking every input to the rows and columns and making sure they're all labeled, because when they're just like floating in the center of a table, that might be a little bit confusing for a screen reader without all of the context that's on the rest of the page. So those are a fairly common pattern, and there's a few things wrong with those. So going in and addressing those issues could have a widespread impact as well. And probably the last thing that I'll address on this topic is hidden labels. Sometimes as we'd be like resizing screens or things like that, you might hide some of the labels on the screen because they might be duplicated based on different section headings or things like that. And it just makes it more clear visually when using a mobile device. But when we do things like that, we had to make sure that all of the labels were still available and still like linked and routed properly using the ARIA attributes, so that screen readers and everything wouldn't suddenly have their label disappear. So those were like some kind of core standard changes that we fixed, and that drastically contributed to the over half of violations that we were able to remove. It's also worth noting in that time that due to the checks we put in place to stop people from adding new violations, there were none added. And another side effect was around color contrast. So as Kendall mentioned, in our reports for developers, we turned off the color contrast rules initially. And that was kind of two pieces. One was there was a lot of color contrast. So it's just our whole reports would be flooded with them if we turned it on. But the other piece was, in order to fix that, it requires a full like design approach for that refreshes a lot of the designs through the product to have better contrast. And that's not something we would necessarily be addressing on the development side of things. But we still wanted to kind of push that project forward. And we had a lot of great design partners who were working on actually doing those refreshes. So now that we had reports available, we could turn on color contrast and generate a report to start talking with our design partners on where to prioritize their work to improve the contrast. And so even though in the first month we were able to get rid of over half the violations, that became increasingly slower as time went on. As you can imagine, we were addressing these widespread problems first, which means the last things that we're addressing might only be occurring once in the entire product, and they require specialized tweaking and debugging to figure out what's actually going on. And in fact, the final 15 violations that we solved were a problem that occurred only on a single page. And so it just required as much development time to solve one X violation as it did to solve 500 in the early part, which makes it a bit harder. But even with that, we were able to reach 0 X violations in about 5 months. And that was just with some constant work each sprint to kind of focus on whittling away at the remaining problems and prioritizing it. One thing I would note is over time, we did find more violations because we would update ACTS, and ACTS would actually have new rules available and it would find new violations, which is great, but it would also mean that our numbers would go up and we'd have to address those as well. And one of the things that did help make this process easier is as we were going along, we were also doing development work to introduce new designs or refresh designs in the product. And so as we were taking on those tasks, we could come into them and make sure that we were also addressing some accessibility issues at the same time, or making sure that any new designs we added had no AX violations. So that kind of helped us whittle away while including accessibility in other work streams as well. And in order to kind of make sure we were tracking along the project along the way, we made sure to take some time each sprint to just read the AX reports and create bugs for what we saw as the next set of issues that needed to be addressed. And while we were kind of going through and solving those problems, we found a few things that made it easier along the way. One thing was it really helped to publish a build of the TurboTax UI every time somebody was making a code change in such a way that you could go on different devices, or different team members could easily navigate to a URL and test out your change and see what happened. And why this was really helpful is, like, for example, if we're testing in multiple screen readers as well, those might require Windows. Some of our developers might be on Windows versus Mac, and you want to be able to just quickly send a URL either to another computer that you have or to another teammate or a QA and have them pull it up and take a look. And that also helps you with some screen size testing and things as well. And then also on the development side, we focused on adding a few linting rules that could help us be more accessible and find accessibility problems inside of our code editor, instead of getting all of our results from AX once it's actually on the page. And so one of the tools that was helpful for that was a package called ESLint plugin JSX accessibility. And that one helps you find issues or have hints for accessibility in React. And then we also added another one for CSS called StyleLint accessibility. And one of the things that was really helpful out of that plugin is, over time we had started trying to make sure we had reduced motion support across the product. And the StyleLint accessibility plugin allowed us to warn developers anytime they add a CSS animation that they need to make sure to account for reduced motion.
So yeah, we have some kind of outcomes of this and our thoughts on automation in general. Do you want to go to the next slide? So automation covers about 1/3 of all accessibility violations. So it's important to lean on it, but also not to solely use it when you're testing accessibility. Automation can fall short in areas that are subjective rules, for example, maybe things that are harder to test. And it's important to do manual testing, such as visual, keyboard nav, and screen reader testing as well. And expect things to change. So guidelines are always being updated to improve user experience. We're learning things every day about users and better ways to display information on the web. So expect new versions of rules and automated tools to align with those guidelines. And it's important to stay up to date on those. And accessibility should start at the design level, not at the development level. Overall, if your designs are accessible, you'll save time during the development stage and not having to go back and forth with design later. And one way we found that we can help that is we encourage accessible design by creating tools to make design easier to produce. An example of this was adding a color contrast checker that pulls Intuit color schemes and allows design to check those colors that they select from the Intuit design library and to make sure that they meet color contrast. Right here we have on this slide we have an image of our old version of TurboTax. We have a lot of things happening here that are kind of hard for users to be able to see. So we have buttons that have very light coloring, as well as text that's not very dark, and it's hard for users to be able to find those on the page and be able to navigate to them. So From our Axe automation, we were able to make a different display. If we go to the next slide, we increased color contrast. We used a darker teal in our library, and we increased typography sizing, as well as changed the colors. So again, ongoing process, but we're trying to update designs just to reflect what Axe is showing us on the automation side. I think you're muted, Tyler.
Yep. And so as we kind of get towards the end of the talk, we'd like to point out a couple of open source projects that we created along the way doing all of this work. And if you're doing a similar sort of work on your projects, then maybe these would be helpful for you and can help you also integrate some of the things we talked about. The first project here is called Proof. It is available on the public GitHub for github.com/intuit/proof. And what it does is it's a test runner for a project called Storybook. Storybook is a very popular project for documenting your user interface. So if you're building React components or Vue or Angular or anything, there's a chance you're using Storybook as your documentation site. And if you're doing that, this test runner can let you go and run tests against your documentation. And it includes a plugin for Axe, which we use on our projects, and that will generate the report of Axe violations. So you can basically tell it, go grab every story in our documentation site and go and run Axe on it and give us the results and kind of compile that. So that's really handy if you have the same workflow as us. And the second project, which was released very recently, actually only in the last week, is called Accessibility Snippets. And it's an extension for the Visual Studio Code code editor. And it adds a bunch of ARIA snippets that help you quickly piece together an accessible interface if you're using React. It's got a lot of the common pieces of code that you would put in as you're building out React components. Since this was only released very recently, it might not be in the distributed versions of slides, but we'll try to make sure that the link is posted in the channel. And we're also, we'll have it all available. It's free and open source, and it's on github.com/intuit, and then it's accessibility snippets. And so with that, it looks like we were done a little bit early, but we're happy to take some time with questions, and feel free to drop those in.
All right, thank you so much, Tyler and Kendall. Let's get into some of your questions. And just a reminder, you can use the little thumbs up icon in the Q&A if there's a particular question that you would like to see answered. So I'll kick it off with this first question here. How did you identify the 13 high impact components that you referenced?
Do you want
Yeah,
me to
that's.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was actually a little bit more difficult. Actually, that's probably something we could have covered a little more. So when we started running Axe against our pages, we could kind of see a few things that helped us group and identify that. One was we already kind of knew the grouping of our types of pages. So it was pretty easy to start to pick out, more violations are happening on this type of page, so we can sort of zero in on that. And then part of it too was when Axe was giving us results, it would give us, invalid ARIA owns property or something, and we could see that there was a ton of them. And so with that, we could drill in and say, what's causing this? Okay, that is coming from links or something like that. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach to that. We would look at types of screens that had a high number and drill into the number of components manually by looking at the screen. and we would look at Axe violations by number, and we try to figure out for any violation, why is this one so high? And sometimes that could be multiple components involved, and you kind of have to figure that out through a manual review. But often if there was like one rule that was really sticking out, it was a chance that it was kind of a widespread component that had that particular issue with it.
Awesome. Thanks for the clarification on that. Next question here is, how do you consolidate accessibility reports from different teams / product? Do you do it manually, or is there any tools you help to automate with that?
That's a great question. Luckily for us, like the set of mock screens that we use for testing, as well as some of the other screens in the interview experience, all of those kind of span a large number of teams already. So we don't have to necessarily coordinate as much down to specific teams as we're doing the design refreshes. But I know like there is some different work that goes on with maybe the marketing sites or something. And we don't necessarily have combined sets of data for all of them, but there is kind of an internal community of people who are working on accessibility across products at Intuit. And so between the different teams and the representatives who are involved with accessibility, then we have more visibility into issues. But definitely not a perfectly solved problem. But yeah, it's something that's always ongoing.
Yeah, to touch on that, with our design systems, we do know which teams are using which components. We are able to find metrics on which repos our components show up in. So recently we had found an accessibility violation, and we were able to look at our metrics and say, okay, 22 repos are using this component. We need to get on it and have them update it. The nice part is we make the fix in the design system, and then all it takes is the team just updating the version.
Awesome. All right, next question here has a couple of parts. How did you prevent new accessibility bugs from being merged? Automated testing on PRs, that pull requests, I'm assuming, that prevented them from being merged while there were violations? What did you do about developers saying, I don't know how to fix this, if they didn't have any accessibility skills?
So the nice thing is we're a smaller team. So for us, it was fairly easy. We were a team of 4 at the time, and we were all very adamant about not adding in new violations. But I've definitely seen at different companies, you have a project and varies, like lots of people are working on it. I guess it falls kind of the same under tests in general. You don't merge code that has a failing test in automation, right? This is the same thing. So you're not going to merge the code if a new Axe violation is showing. Granted, if you have 2,000 violations and you're fixing 15 right now, but you can't tackle all 2,000, that's understood. Those violations were there before, but we just really focused on not introducing new ones, and making sure that count was pretty consistent. So, and again, the results did show up on our PR. So when someone's reviewing your PR on the team, they can easily see that it was 2,000 violations before, now it's 5,000. We have a problem. That's kind of an exaggeration, but
And to add on to that, it wasn't like necessarily perfectly exact. We used it through GitHub, so it would actually in GitHub stop you from clicking the button while there was an outstanding thing. But what it would do is it would look at how many violations the specific screen had before your change, and then how many it had after. So technically you could get something through where somebody fixes a few and then introduces a few, which I don't think ever happened, but was entirely within possibility. And then I think the other thing, to kind of answer the third part, I think that's come up a bit more in the design system work as we've kind of expanded that, where there's more developers who are involved creating new components, or maybe they get a design and they're actually contributing that design to the central system as something new. and then our test might pop up and say, hey, there's accessibility violations, you can't merge. And it does happen where we have people who aren't super experienced with any of the ARIA attributes, or maybe even aren't experienced with HTML and JavaScript, and this is their first thing they're implementing. And so it does require a bit of training. And one thing that's really helpful is Intuit has a kind of community group for accessibility called the Accessibility Champions that is run by Ted Drake, kind of the accessibility lead for the company. And so if our team was ever unable to kind of come in and help and answer questions, there are other people who have time around the company to kind of step in and help people. I mean, ultimately, the change won't go in until we feel like everything's been addressed. But hopefully the developers who are contributing feel like they're getting the resources they need to actually address the problem up front. So the goal is that everyone comes away from it like learning something and with like a positive experience, as opposed to we just blocked them and said fix it, and they're retrying until it works. It's very much like a collaborative process.
Right. Accessibility as a team sport, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, got there. So this question asks, Kendall mentioned that automation tools may generate just a fraction of the actual WCAG violations. What percentage of the effort up to now was put into automated testing versus manual testing, would you say?
Gosh, I guess like it's hard to get into percentages. For us, when we first added acts into our repo, we really wanted to focus on those violations. We still, as we add new components and features, are checking the keyboard nav and visual and screen reader testing. I don't know, like what, Tyler, what do you think, like percentage wise? I guess we're really focused.
Yeah, I would say up front, like up front, almost all of our time was spent on fixing those automated violations, because as Kendall mentioned, like X doesn't really have false positives. So we knew that like 0 was a target that was like somewhat reasonable. And we knew that those were like real issues that we needed to solve. In tandem to that, though, as we're fixing those issues, we're getting more accustomed to what kind of things can come up. And we also were kind of discovering new areas of the product or things that could use a bit more of a manual touch to kind of review all of it. I'd say like more, it's definitely shifted towards the opposite now. I mean, if the project has 0 violations now, and like a component is added or something, it might get 3 issues or something against it. Those are pretty easy to fix. But we are still fixing more and more accessibility violations, and most of those are coming from some sort of manual review. And we kind of treat the automation as like a strict baseline for, we should be addressing all of those, and then beyond that, we can improve. And like one good example of that is we just did a pass through a lot of the different interactive elements and said, is there anything on this page that is describing this interactive element that isn't properly linked with like a described by or something like that? Because it might have, a description on it, but there might be visually 3 or 4 things that are describing it on the screen. And so the automated tool is just checking that like you have the descriptive element. We want to make sure it's including all of them. And so that was something that you kind of have to do a bit more manually. But because we had the baseline of making sure everything was described, we could start to identify, oh, yeah, it's described, but really there's like this section header that's also describing it that isn't included. Like, let's loop back and fix that. So kind of high level, it started pretty much 100% automated and it's kind of flipped to like probably 80% manual now, because we can trust the automation.
And like, yeah, more of the subjective things that are harder to check through automation, like is your description accurate? Does your button just say click me? Because that's not helpful. So those things really can't be checked with automation, but we want to make sure that that's still being tested.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And I just wanted to call attention, I believe I starred this in the Q&A for our audience here, but Glenda, the Good Witch Sims, did chime in. She had a presentation another time at AxCon, which you can catch on demand, that some recent data that actually DQ has pulled together shows that 57% of a site's total number of WCAG issues can be found with automation. So just the fact that you're covering your baseline with automation, that goes a very long way, plus manual testing on top of that.
Yeah, that's great context. I didn't even realize it had gotten up that high.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. So I pinned her message in Q&A if anybody wants to check that out. But we have plenty more questions to get into and plenty of time, so I'll keep rolling.
Sounds great.
So here's our next question. How did you track the violations and resolution of them and generate the accompanying charts?
Yeah, originally it was very crude, actually. We use Jenkins for our build pipeline, and Jenkins has a built-in charting mechanism. It's not the most beautiful chart you've ever seen. And it could only do page level granularity, not error, like not X violation level granularity. But originally our charts were just through that because it was very easy to kind of hook in. After that, we switched over to a like more specialized third-party charting application that was already in use inside the company for actually kind of charting some traffic metrics or things like that. We really wanted a line chart, and a lot of the analytics stuff is very good for line charts. So that was kind of it. One thing that was kind of tricky to get all of that information displaying properly is we were running AX results per page, or running AX on different pages as we tested them. And then each individual page could have like multiple AX violations. You could have a page with 10, you could have a page with 1. And initially, the way a lot of our reports worked was each page just got marked as like in violation or not. And we found that that wasn't completely accurate to like what we were actually addressing, because we were focusing on trying to solve the most AX violations, not fix the most screens necessarily. And so we did adjust our reporting to do that. And basically we'd compile out every AX issue per page, and then we'd go and we'd tally that up. And just at the end of every release build, go ahead and publish that metric so it becomes available. But I will say, like, for as kind of low fidelity as the Jenkins build output was, it still did the job, and like it took almost no development work, so we had something even at the start. So there was nothing wrong with that.
Definitely. All right. So this person says, I've used TurboTax for the last 10 years or so, and sometimes I see different components / patterns on different pages. For example, one link opens a modal, another opens side drawer. Is this because of remediation at work?
That's a good question. I think probably the best answer is that the links work that way just because of like different features that were added over time, not necessarily a lot of decisions being made right at this moment. I don't know if you'd add anything, Kendall, to that.
No, like it's definitely, you know, we have a design system. We're trying to get everyone onto the design system, but there's a few different pages that are just a little more legacy that we're still trying to update. But it's great feedback. We still are trying to update.
And I will say, like any piece of software, like there are pieces of the product that may not use our design system. Like some of the states haven't necessarily been rolled over to that, since it's kind of an ongoing process to always keep everything up to date. So you may encounter things on there, and people are still focusing on accessibility for those areas, even if they're a legacy system. So hopefully it's still an okay experience. And if you have issues, definitely report them.
Yes, absolutely.
Things are always in motion with software, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, can you speak a little bit more to how you're using Storybook? So this question is asking, are you able to check accessibility in Storybook using Axe?
Yeah, yes, we create components. We will put a component in Storybook by itself, say a button. So we have a bunch of stories just related to buttons. And we're really easily able to test keyboard interaction. We utilize one of the plugins, Axe, the Axe plugin on Storybook to check that it is meeting those requirements. And it's been a great tool to just really get that component by itself on the page and be able to really focus right there and see what that component's creating issues for, making sure that that's robust enough to use in a lot of places on our platform.
Yeah. And so kind of to build on top of that, like the way we actually run the tests is this project that I mentioned a couple slides previous, which is called Proof. And it's an open source test runner that we built. And we build all of our components in Storybook. And we test them with Axe using the Axe plugin in Storybook. And then we test it with on Axe on CI using Proof. And then when the components actually make it into the product, that's where our extra set of test suites are going on top, and also running Axe again and making sure kind of at the integration level, once a page is built, we know the button is kind of accessible on its own, but then once a page is built with it, is it still accessible? And, is everything labeled properly and things like that. So there's multiple kind of levels to it, but Storybook is how we've been able to document component level changes.
Fantastic. And just for our audience, you did provide a link in the slide deck to this Proof open source. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's in this. I think it's the last slide in the provided slides.
Awesome. All right. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap. So you did mention, if people run into bugs or issues that they should report them. This question is just asking, what are some common bugs that users might report?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to give an example of like something you were working on recently, Kendall?
Yeah, a recent bug that came up was actually, this was a very niche case, but it was using our progress bar. We had a progress bar, or we have a progress bar in TurboTax, and we have it interactive, so you can go down and see buttons inside the progress bar. And it was at the time very hard to interact with. We had roll progress bar on it that made it ARIA read only. So we had to kind of strip the progress bar from roll progress, rethink it, make it still sound to a screen reader like a progress bar, because it really was a progress bar, but still allow it to be interactive and not read only. So being able to utilize ARIA labels and still get those, how many steps are in the progress bar, and be able to showcase that without using an ARIA role. That was kind of like one of my more recent bugs, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you for that example, Kendall. And at that, we are at time. Tyler and Kendall, thank you so much for your awesome presentation. Thank you so much to our audience who has stuck around for our final, but definitely not least presentation of the evening. I just put a link in chat to fill out a survey. We're raffling off 1,000 of these Digital Equality is My Jam tees. So please do fill out that survey about how AxeCon went for you, and we would be greatly appreciative of that. But thanks again to our presenters, our interpreter Daniel. Wonderful. All right, everybody have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you so much for coming to AxeCon.